March 4th, 1969, just past 11 p.m. The jungle around Ben Het Special Forces Camp smelled like diesel exhaust and wet laterite clay. Specialist Frank Hembry, gunner on an M48 Patton, was scanning through his infrared periscope when the tree line erupted in green tracer fire. Streams of it, low and flat, punching across the perimeter wire at a velocity that didn't match small arms. Something heavier was out there, something with a cannon. The crew of that Patton had trained for exactly one kind of war. Armored Doctrine circa 1965 said Vietnam was an infantry fight. Tanks provided fire support, ran convoy escort, maybe flattened a tree line for the grunts. Nobody briefed them on enemy armor, because enemy armor wasn't supposed to be here. The North Vietnamese Army fielded PT-76 light tanks, Soviet-made amphibious vehicles with a 76mm gun, and they'd just driven them down trails that American intelligence had assessed as impassable to tracked vehicles. So what do you do when the enemy shows up with capabilities your own briefings said were impossible? You fight with what you have and figure out doctrine later. If you had family at Ben Het, or if you served with armor in Vietnam and never heard this story told right, drop a comment below. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. A like pushes it to someone else who needs to hear it. Hembry's tank commander, Staff Sergeant Jerry Jones, ordered him to engage. The problem was identification. Through infrared, the shapes moving at the edge of the wire could be anything: trucks, bulldozers, hallucinations, born of adrenaline and green phosphor glow. But then one of those shapes fired, and the muzzle flash was unmistakable. Tank gun. Hembry put his crosshairs on the flash point and sent a 90mm round downrange. What followed was the only confirmed tank versus tank engagement American forces fought in the entire Vietnam War. 3 PT-76s against a platoon of M48s dug into defensive positions. The engagement lasted minutes, not hours. 2 PT-76s were destroyed. The third withdrew. Jones later described the moment he realized they were fighting armor. "I thought somebody was wrong. Either us or the intel." Turned out it wasn't us. The intel had been wrong for years. And the question of what armor could and couldn't do in Vietnam, that question was about to get a lot more complicated. General Bruce Clark stood in front of a sand table at Fort Knox in 1954 and pointed at the Fulda Gap. Every officer in the room understood the scenario. Soviet tank armies would pour through that corridor in central Germany, thousands of T-54s and T-55s rolling west across open farmland, and the only thing standing between them and the Rhine would be American armor. The M48 Patton was built for that day. 52 tons of cast steel hull, a 90mm main gun with stabilization good enough to fire on the move, a Continental AV-1790 gasoline engine that could push it across flat terrain at 30 miles per hour, and a fire control system optimized for long-range overwatch. Every design choice pointed toward one fight: the plains of Northern Europe against Soviet heavy formations in a war that never came. The doctrine was called active defense, and later evolved through several names, but the core idea stayed fixed. American tanks would occupy hull-down positions on prepared terrain, engage at maximum range with superior optics, then displace to alternate positions before Soviet artillery could bracket them. Crew training emphasized gunnery at distances beyond 1,000 meters, and tank commanders built everything else around formation maneuvers across kilometers of open ground. The entire intellectual architecture of American armored warfare assumed you could see the enemy coming from far away, engage him in the open, and use speed to reposition across firm, flat earth. Now put that tank in Vietnam. The M48 weighed 52 tons loaded. Vietnamese bridges were rated for maybe 15. Most roads outside major cities were single-lane laterite tracks that turned to soup in monsoon season, and monsoon season lasted 5 months. The jungle canopy cut visibility to under 50 meters in most operational areas. A tank gun designed to kill other tanks at 1,500 meters was now engaging targets it couldn't see until they were close enough to throw a grenade. The gasoline engine was the worst part. The AV-1790 ran hot, drank fuel at a rate of about half a mile per gallon cross-country, and critically, used gasoline instead of diesel. A single RPG-2 or RPG-7 round punching through the hull could ignite the fuel. NVA soldiers figured this out fast. The after-action reports from early engagements are blunt about it. Crews called their own tanks Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, borrowing a nickname that went all the way back to the M4 Sherman in World War II. Different war, different jungle, same problem. Gasoline burns. Every assumption baked into the Patton's design failed simultaneously. The stabilized gun that allowed accurate fire on the move didn't matter when you were crawling at 4 miles per hour through elephant grass. Hull armor designed to defeat Soviet anti-tank rounds at range performed differently against shaped-charge warheads fired from 20 feet away in an ambush. Meanwhile, the suspension, built for European roads, broke down on laterite and volcanic rock at rates that kept maintenance crews working around the clock. The Army's initial response was to keep tanks in reserve or limit them to road-bound operations and fire-based defense. Armor officers arriving in-country between 1965 and 67 found themselves commanding what amounted to mobile pillboxes. The institutional attitude from MACV headquarters was clear enough. This is an infantry war with helicopter support. Tanks are a logistics burden that can't go where the fighting is. The assessment held until somebody actually tested it. The problem wasn't that tanks couldn't operate in Vietnamese terrain. The problem was that nobody had tried hard enough, because doctrine said it shouldn't work. And doctrine, in this case, was a set of assumptions about a European war designed by men who had never driven a Patton through a rice paddy. The tankers who did drive through those paddies discovered something the doctrine writers hadn't predicted. The M48 could go places nobody thought possible, if you threw out the manual and let the crews figure it out on their own. What they invented in the field, under fire, with no institutional support and no doctrinal framework to guide them, would eventually force the entire Army to rethink what armored vehicles were for. 600 and counting. That's how many M113 armored personnel carriers were operating in Vietnam by mid-1966, and almost none of them were being used the way the Army intended. The M113 was designed as a battlefield taxi, drive infantry to the fight, drop them off, pull back. The aluminum hull could stop small arms fire but nothing heavier, and the single 50 caliber machine gun mounted on top required the gunner to stand exposed from the chest up to fire it. In its first engagements, NVA snipers picked off those gunners with brutal efficiency. The fix came from the crews themselves. Welding shops at base camps started fabricating gun shields out of scrap steel. Improvised armor plates bolted around the 50 cal mount to give the gunner partial cover. Then somebody added 2 M60 machine guns on pintles along the cargo hatch, one per side, each with its own shield. The result was a vehicle the Army hadn't designed and doctrine hadn't anticipated. The Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle, or ACAV. Instead of dropping infantry off and retreating, ACAV crews drove straight into ambushes with all 3 guns blazing. The M113 went from taxi to assault platform because a welder and a sergeant decided the manual was wrong. The ammunition told the same story. Tank crews discovered that the 90mm high-explosive anti-tank round, the one designed to kill Soviet armor, was nearly useless against dispersed infantry in tree lines. What worked was canister. An M4984 canister round turned the Patton's main gun into a giant shotgun, spraying 1,200 steel flechettes in a spreading cone out to 200 meters. One round could shred an entire ambush line. Crews started carrying canister as their primary load, with maybe 4 or 5 anti-tank rounds kept just in case. The M546 Beehive round did something similar for the 105mm howitzers at firebases. 8,000 flechettes per shell, fired on direct lay at human wave assaults during Tet. An artilleryman at Fire Support Base Burt described what a Beehive round did to a charging NVA company. There was nobody left standing, not in that sector. The wire was just empty. Look at the pattern. Every adaptation moved in the same direction, away from long-range anti-armor warfare toward close-range, high-volume anti-personnel lethality. The crews didn't wait for the Pentagon to issue new field manuals. They rebuilt their vehicles and swapped their ammunition loads. They invented tactics that contradicted everything Fort Knox had taught them. The institution hadn't caught up yet. But someone at the top was finally paying attention. April 1967, Highway 13 north of Saigon, 7:45 a.m. A column of M48s from the 2nd Battalion, 34th Armor, was rolling through rubber plantation country when the lead tank lurched sideways and stopped dead. The blast crater under its left track was 4 feet across. Before the crew could react, RPG rounds came from both flanks simultaneously. 5, 6, maybe 8 of them in under 3 seconds. The NVA had watched American armor operate for 2 years. They had taken notes. The RPG-2 was the first-generation threat, a Soviet-designed shoulder-fired weapon with an 82mm shaped charge warhead, effective out to about 150 meters. Against the M48's cast steel hull, it could penetrate if it hit at the right angle. And in jungle ambushes, the angles were always right because the range was always close. But the RPG-2 had a slow rocket motor and a visible smoke trail. Alert gunners could sometimes spot the shooter before he fired. The RPG-7 changed that calculus completely. Fielded by NVA units starting in 1968, it carried a larger warhead with better penetration, flew faster, and could defeat the frontal armor of an M113 at any range a jungle ambush allowed. One soldier with one weapon and a single round, and a 14-ton armored vehicle was burning. Mines killed more armor than RPGs did. The records are consistent on this point across every unit that tracked the data. Pressure-detonated anti-tank mines, command-detonated charges using salvaged American ordnance, even rigged artillery shells buried in road surfaces. Mines accounted for roughly 70% of all armored vehicle losses in some operational areas. The NVA and Viet Cong didn't need sophisticated technology. They needed patience, a shovel, knowledge of which roads American columns used repeatedly, and time. Tankers developed an almost superstitious dread of certain routes. You could up armor against RPGs and suppress ambush positions with canister and machine gun fire, but you could not fight the ground itself. The crews adapted again. Mine rollers pushed ahead of lead vehicles while infantry dismounted to sweep roads on foot before armor passed. Tank commanders learned to read terrain for disturbance patterns. Fresh dirt, displaced vegetation, anything that suggested someone had been digging. All of this slowed movement to a crawl and negated the speed advantage armor was supposed to provide. The NVA had effectively dictated the tempo of American armored operations using weapons that cost almost nothing. Then came the weapon that rewired everything the Pentagon thought it understood about tank vulnerability. Easter Offensive, 1972. NVA forces rolled south with T-54 tanks and infantry in a conventional invasion, and ARVN units met them with American-supplied M48s. During fighting near Dong Ha, a Soviet-made AT-3 Sagar anti-tank guided missile struck an ARVN Patton and destroyed it. Wire-guided and man-portable, effective out to 3,000 meters. A single operator with a suitcase-sized launcher and a joystick could kill a main battle tank from nearly 2 miles away. The crew never saw the shooter. The tank was dead before anyone understood what had hit it. The Sagar's appearance in Vietnam was a preview. 18 months later, Egyptian infantry, armed with the same weapon, would annihilate Israeli armor in the opening hours of the Yom Kippur War, destroying hundreds of tanks in the Sinai. But the first proof of concept happened in Vietnam against an American-made tank, and the after-action reports went straight to the Pentagon's armor development offices. What those offices did with that information would reshape the next 40 years of armored vehicle design. Sergeant First Class Hugh Havermale felt the ground shake before he heard anything. The first explosion came from the western perimeter wire at Ben Het, somewhere around 11 p.m. on March 3, 1969. Mortar rounds followed, 60 and 82 millimeter, walking across the camp in a pattern that meant registered fire, pre-planned, zeroed in during previous probes. The NVA had been hitting Ben Het with standoff attacks for weeks. But this felt different. The ground kept shaking in a rhythm that didn't match incoming shells. Engines. Ben Het sat on a red laterite hilltop in the central highlands near the tri-border area where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia met. 400 Montagnard irregulars held the perimeter under the direction of a 12-man Special Forces A-team. The camp's heavy firepower came from a platoon of M48 Patton tanks, 4 vehicles from the 1st Platoon, 69th Armor. They had been positioned at Ben Het specifically because intelligence suggested the NVA 202nd Armored Regiment was operating in the area with Soviet-built PT-76 light tanks. Nobody at Max V was entirely sure the report was accurate. Armor on armor in the Vietnamese jungle sounded like somebody's bad guess. The PT-76 was an amphibious reconnaissance tank. 14 tons, a 76mm main gun, thin aluminum and steel hull designed to swim across rivers, not slug it out with medium armor. Against an M48, the mismatch was severe. The Patton's 90mm gun could punch through the PT-76 at virtually any combat range. Going the other direction, the 76mm round would struggle to penetrate the Patton's frontal armor even at point-blank distance. On paper, this should have been no contest, but paper doesn't account for midnight in a jungle camp under mortar barrage with visibility near zero and your infantry screaming on the radio that something is pushing through the wire. The tank crews couldn't see what was coming. Ben Het had no illumination rounds left. They'd been expended during earlier attacks. Starlight scopes, the early generation night vision devices, were mounted on some of the tanks, but the image quality was marginal. What the crews had was the xenon searchlight mounted on each Patton's turret, fitted with an infrared filter that worked in conjunction with the IR-capable gun sights. In theory, the light was invisible to the naked eye. In practice, it painted the target in a ghostly green wash that the gunner could see through his scope while the enemy saw nothing. The first PT-76 materialized at less than 400 meters, grinding through the outer wire on the camp's western face. The lead Patton's gunner acquired it through his infrared sight, a dark shape trailing sparks where the concertina wire dragged under its hull. He fired. The 90mm round hit the PT-76 in the turret, and the vehicle brewed up instantly, ammunition cooking off in a column of white and orange flame that lit the entire perimeter for a few seconds. In that light, the American crews saw a second PT-76 behind the first. Then a third. The engagement lasted roughly 20 minutes. The Pattons fired from their prepared positions inside the camp, engaging targets that were driving directly into their fields of fire across open ground. Exactly the scenario Fort Knox had trained them for, compressed from European kilometers down to a few hundred meters of cleared jungle. 2 PT-76s were confirmed destroyed. A third was claimed as a probable kill, found burned out the next morning about 500 meters from the perimeter. NVA infantry that had been advancing behind the tanks pulled back when their armor died. The ground assault collapsed. No American tanks were lost, no tankers killed. The Montagnard defenders held the perimeter wire. For one night in the Central Highlands, the old doctrine worked perfectly. Prepared positions, superior optics, better armor, bigger gun, trained crews engaging at range against an enemy advancing in the open. Everything the armor school had promised since 1954 happened exactly the way the sand table said it would. The 4 Patton crews at Ben Het fought the European war they'd been trained for, on a hilltop in Vietnam, against 14-ton Soviet tanks that never should have been there. The Army celebrated Ben Het, the only American tank versus tank engagement of the entire war, and the Patton won it clean. But one question hung over the result, and nobody at the Pentagon wanted to answer it. What happens when the enemy stops cooperating? Colonel Don Grubb was halfway through his briefing at the armor school when a brigadier general in the second row cut him off. Grubb had spent 12 months commanding an armored cavalry squadron in 3rd Corps. He had the data, vehicle loss reports, ammunition expenditure records, after-action reviews documenting every field modification his crews had welded onto their M113s. The brigadier wasn't interested. The war was winding down. The Army needed to refocus on the Sino-Viet threat on the Fulda Gap. Vietnam was an aberration. Grubb finished his briefing to a room that had already made up its mind. The institutional resistance was fierce. Between 1970 and 1975, the armor school at Fort Knox produced revised field manuals that barely mentioned Vietnam. The ACAV configuration, the improvised gun shields and triple-mounted machine guns that had kept thousands of soldiers alive, received almost no doctrinal recognition. Canister rounds, the ammunition that crews had demanded over standard anti-tank loads, stayed classified as a secondary munition. The men who had rewritten armored warfare with welding torches and battlefield intuition came home to an institution that wanted to forget everything they'd learned. Why? Part of it was political. Vietnam was toxic. Nobody wanted their name attached to lessons from a lost war. But the deeper problem was doctrinal ego. Admitting that Vietnam had changed the fundamentals meant admitting that 2 decades of armor doctrine had been built on assumptions about where and how American tanks would fight. assumptions that proved dangerously narrow. The Army had spent 20 years preparing for one specific war. When it got a different one, the institution's first instinct was to pretend the different war didn't count. The Yom Kippur War broke that pretense open. October 1973. Israeli armor, some of the best-trained tank crews on Earth, drove into the Sinai expecting to sweep Egyptian infantry the way they'd swept them in '67. Instead, they drove into a wall of AT-3 Sagar missiles, the same weapon that had killed an ARVN Patton at Dongha 18 months earlier. In the first 48 hours, Israel lost roughly 260 tanks. Entire battalions ceased to exist. The Sagar operators were conscript infantrymen with a few weeks of training, and they were destroying 60-ton main battle tanks at ranges where the tank crews couldn't even identify the launch point. The after-action reports from Dongha had predicted exactly this. Nobody had listened. The smell of burned hydraulic fluid hung over the Sinai battlefields for weeks. Israeli recovery crews described popping hatches on Centurion and M48 Patton tanks to find interiors scorched black by shaped charge penetration, molten copper spall coating every surface, crew positions that told their own story without words. The Sagar's warhead didn't just penetrate armor, it turned the inside of the tank into a superheated pressure vessel. The Pentagon sent observers. They came back shaken. After that, the resistance cracked. It happened unevenly and messily, but the Yom Kippur evidence was impossible to dismiss. The Army created Training and Doctrine Command. TRADOC, under General William Dupuy, a Vietnam veteran who had commanded the 1st Infantry Division in '66 and '67. Dupuy had watched his own mechanized infantry get chewed up by mines and RPGs on Highway 13. He understood what the jungle had been trying to teach. Under his direction, TRADOC produced FM 100-5, the 1976 edition of Operations, a field manual that for the first time acknowledged the anti-tank guided missile as a primary battlefield threat and demanded that armor operate as part of a combined arms team rather than as an independent striking force. Infantry wasn't support for tanks anymore. Tanks were support for a system. The M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle came out of this rethinking. So did the M1 Abrams, designed from the start with Chabam composite armor specifically engineered to defeat shaped charge warheads. The same physics that had been killing American vehicles since RPG-2s started hitting M113s in 1965. Reactive armor, active protection systems, infantry armor integration doctrine, all of it traces back to a war the Army spent 5 years trying to forget. Colonel Grubb retired in 1978. His briefing slides from the armor school, the ones the brigadier didn't want to hear, ended up in the archives at Fort Knox. Researchers found them in the early 2000s, filed with no annotation and no follow-up memo, nothing to indicate anyone had ever acted on the data. The crews had figured it out. The institution took a decade and another country's catastrophe to catch up. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Ewing pulled the breech block from his Patton's 90mm gun on a maintenance pad at Long Bin in August 1971 and set it on an oil-stained tarp. The rifling was worn smooth in places. 18 months of firing canister, high explosive, and white phosphorus rounds. Ammunition the gun was never optimized for had eaten the barrel down past serviceable tolerances. The bore erosion gauge confirmed what Ewing already knew by looking. Done. That gun had been designed to kill T-54s at 2,000 meters across the North German plain. Instead, it had spent a year and a half shredding tree lines at point-blank range and collapsing bunker complexes, turning jungle ambush sites into splinter fields when nothing better was available. The 90mm M41 gun was an anti-tank weapon forced into the role of direct-fire artillery, close support cannon, anti-personnel system, and counter-ambush platforms simultaneously. It performed all of those jobs. It was built for none of them. The official record of what happened to American armor doctrine in Vietnam is scattered across dozens of archives. MACV Armor Officer reports sit in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, filed under Record Group 472. The Grubb briefing slides ended up in the Patton Museum collection before it moved from Fort Knox to Fort Benning. Unit after action reviews from the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment fill 14 boxes, most of them declassified in the 1990s, some still partially redacted. The ACAV modification that saved more lives than any single doctrinal decision of the war was eventually codified in Technical Manual 9-2300-256-34, published in 1969, 2 full years after crews had already figured it out and welded it together themselves. 14 boxes, a technical manual number. That's how the Army recorded a revolution. The M48 Patton served in Vietnam from 1965 through 1972. Roughly 600 were deployed at peak strength. They operated in every core tactical zone, from the Mekong Delta to the DMZ. Total tank losses to all causes remain difficult to pin down. Sources conflict between 80 and 120 vehicles, depending on how you count recoverable damage versus total write-offs. The war that wasn't supposed to involve armor became one of the most intensive periods of armored operations since Korea. Ewing shipped home 2 weeks after pulling that breech block. Years later, an interviewer asked him what Vietnam taught him about tanks. His answer was 4 words: "We made it work."